The first sign is not a palace, not a crown, not a broken wall rising from the surf. It is something quieter, stranger, and far more unsettling, a piece of ancient bone dragged from the floor of the North Sea. A flint tool caught in a fishing net. The dark stump of a drowned tree appearing for a moment beneath shifting sand before the tide covers it again. Out there, where cold grey water now rolls between Britain and mainland Europe, there was once land, not a narrow bridge, not a temporary strip of mud, but a vast low world of rivers, marshes, lakes, forests, and open plains. People walked there, animals grazed there, fires burned there, children learned the paths between water and woodland. Hunters followed red deer through misty valleys that no longer have names. Then, over thousands of years, the sea rose and took it all. This is the lost kingdom swallowed by the sea, though the word kingdom must be handled carefully. There were no stone castles on this drowned plain, no royal tombs, no armies marching beneath banners. The people who lived there belonged to a far older world, long before written records, long before states, long before kings in the familiar sense. Yet the landscape itself was large enough, rich enough, and central enough to deserve that almost legendary language. It was a human world between worlds, a place that joined what are now separate shores, a place that may once have seemed stable and generous, until the horizon itself began to move. Today it is often called Doggerland, named after Doggerbank, a broad shallow area of the North Sea that still hints at the drowned terrain below. But the name is modern. The people who lived there had their own words, their own mental maps, their own memories of rivers and hunting grounds, and none of those words survive. What survives in the record suggests something both intimate and immense, across beaches, seabeds, museum collections, and scientific surveys. Fragments keep appearing. Antler tools, worked flints, bones of mammoth and aurochs, pollen locked in sediment, ancient river channels traced beneath the sea by seismic imaging. Each clue is small by itself. Together they reveal that the seafloor was not always seafloor, it was a homeland. The mystery begins because this homeland vanished almost completely. Most lost cities leave ruins, most collapsed civilizations leave walls, pottery, inscriptions, or graves that can be walked around and measured. Doggerland leaves a different kind of absence. It lies under water, under sand, under layers of silt moved by tides and storms. Its archaeology has to be recovered by accident or searched for with machines that read buried landscapes through sound. No one can stroll through its villages. No one can stand beside its old rivers. The places where families once slept may now be crossed by trawlers, cargo ships, and wind farm survey vessels. The ordinary geography of one age has become the invisible geology of another. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story of this drowned world is not only about an ancient shoreline, it is about how completely the earth can change beneath human feet, and how quickly a familiar world can become impossible to imagine. To understand the pull of the mystery, it helps to begin at the modern coast, where the North Sea can seem permanent. Its waves strike the beaches of eastern England, the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark with the steady authority of something that has always been there. The sea looks ancient beyond argument, but in geological terms, its present shape is young. During the last ice age, so much water was locked in glaciers that global sea levels were far lower than they are today. The shallow basin of the southern North Sea stood exposed. Britain was not an island in the way it is now. It was part of a broader landmass connected to Europe by plains and river valleys, where water now separates countries, animals and people could move. The scale is difficult to picture because modern maps train the mind to treat coastlines as fixed borders. But coastlines are not fixed. They are temporary agreements between land, water, climate, and time. At the end of the Ice Age, as the climate warmed and ice sheets melted, that agreement changed. Seas rose, rivers backed up, valleys flooded, marshes spread, forests drowned. The land did not disappear in a single night, at least not at first. It withdrew in stages. A hunting route became a wetland, a campsite became a shoreline, a hill became an island, a memory became a story told farther inland. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how densely populated Doggerland was, how people used its different environments, and how they experienced the loss. But the broad outline is clear. Human groups occupied or moved through this landscape during the Mesolithic period, after the great ice sheets retreated and before farming transformed much of Europe. These were hunter-gatherer fishers, skilled at reading seasons, animal movement, tides, tracks, plant growth, and weather. They did not live in a world of emptiness, they lived in a world full of signs. For them, Doggerland may have been less a single territory than a changing mosaic. There were riverbanks where fish could be trapped or speared, reed beds alive with birds, stands of birch and pine, patches of hazel, open grasslands, peat-forming wetlands, and places where large animals moved between feeding grounds. Red deer, roe deer, wild boar, elk, aurochs, and smaller game would have drawn hunters across the plain. Seals and fish may have drawn others toward tidal margins as the sea came closer. Seasonal movement mattered, knowledge mattered, a person who knew where dry ground remained after winter floods, where flint could be found, where herds crossed, and where shellfish gathered carried a map more valuable than any carved boundary. And yet the sea kept coming. There is a haunting patience to this kind of disaster. Modern imagination often prefers the sudden catastrophe, the wave on the horizon, the city drowned, the last desperate climb to higher ground. Doggerland does contain one such violent moment, a prehistoric tsunami linked to the massive Storegga submarine landslide off the coast of Norway. That event sent waves across parts of the North Atlantic and North Sea, and it may have struck remaining low-lying areas with terrifying force, but no single explanation fully accounts for the drowning of the whole landscape. The deeper story is slower, and in some ways more disturbing. The disaster was not only a wave, it was centuries of rising water, generations of retreat, a world becoming less reliable one shoreline at a time. Imagine a family returning to a place known by grandparents and finding it altered. The old stand of trees is dead, its roots drowned in brackish water. A freshwater pool tastes of salt. A crossing used in childhood is now too deep. Birds gather where people once walked. The ground trembles underfoot in peat and mud. Farther away, a familiar ridge still rises above the wetland. But beyond it, the water shines where there used to be land. No written record preserves such a moment. No voice tells us how people felt. But human experience leaves patterns even when words vanish. People adapt. They move camps. They shift diets. They change routes. They remember dangerous places. They teach children not to trust certain ground. They turn loss into knowledge because survival requires it. The surprising detail is that this lost world was not discovered through one grand archaeological expedition. It emerged through scraps and accidents. For decades, fishermen working the North Sea pulled up bones and antlers from animals that had no business living in open water. Dredging operations brought up prehistoric tools. Scientists began to realize that beneath the waves lay preserved traces of ancient rivers and landscapes. Later, oil and gas exploration provided seismic data that could be reinterpreted by researchers, allowing them to map valleys, channels, and landforms hidden below the seabed. A vanished world began to reappear not as a romantic ruin, but as a ghost map built from industry, chance, and patient science. That is part of what makes Doggerland so powerful. It is not a myth that became archaeology, it is archaeology that feels like myth. It shows that entire human landscapes can disappear without leaving monuments above the waterline. It reminds us that the boundary between history and prehistory is not simply a matter of time, but of survival in the record. If a people build in stone, dry climates may preserve them. If they live lightly in wood, hide, bone, fibre, and earth. And then the sea covers their world. They become far harder to see. Their lives were not less real because they left fewer ruins. Their disappearance was not less profound because no poet wrote it down. So the story begins with absence of blank space on the modern map that was never blank at all. Beneath the North Sea lies a buried landscape that once connected islands to continents, rivers to coasts, animals to migration paths, and human groups to the places that fed them. It was not swallowed in a single gulp, but taken by inches, tides, storms, meltwater, and time. Its people did not watch the end from a distance. They lived inside the transformation, and somewhere under the waves. Under sediments and sandbanks, the old land still holds its dark shape, waiting for each new fragment to rise from the sea and remind the present that a world can vanish so completely that only the water remembers where it was. Before the water comes, the lost land is not lost. It is simply there, wide and low beneath a cold northern sky, stretching across the space that later ages will fill with maps of sea lanes and national borders. The air carries the smell of wet grass, river mud, resin, smoke, and animal hide. Mist gathers in the hollows before sunrise. Rivers move slowly through shallow valleys, splitting and rejoining across floodplains where reeds stand higher than a person's shoulder. In some places the ground is firm and open, marked by hoofprints and old trails. In others it gives way to marsh, peat, and pools dark enough to reflect the clouds like polished stone. This is not a drowned world yet. It is a living one. The shape of that world changes across thousands of years, and the evidence remains incomplete, but the broad pattern is clear enough to imagine with care. During the colder height of the last ice age, sea level is far lower because enormous quantities of water are locked away in ice sheets. Britain is joined to the European mainland, and the exposed basin of the North Sea forms a vast region of plains, river systems, and tundra-like or steppe environments. As the climate warms after the last glacial maximum, the landscape softens, ice retreats, plants return, animals follow. The exposed land becomes not one fixed scene, but a sequence of changing environments. Open, wind-swept terrain gives way in many areas to shrubs, birch, pine, grasses, wetlands, and eventually richer woodland. What survives in the record suggests a landscape in motion long before the sea finishes its work. It is tempting to imagine Doggerland as a single flat plain, but that picture is too simple. Like any real landscape, it has variety. There are higher ridges, river terraces, lake basins, marshy depressions, dry patches, sandier ground, and channels carved by older waters. One of the most important systems in this buried geography is sometimes described by researchers as a great river network, fed by rivers from different directions and flowing across land now hidden beneath the waves. The details of these channels are still studied and revised, but seismic surveys reveal valleys and drainage patterns that show how complex the terrain once was. This was not empty mud waiting to be submerged. It was a patterned world, shaped by water even before the ocean arrived. To the west lies the land that will become Britain. To the east and south lie the lands that will become the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, and beyond them the greater European interior. Between them, Doggerland offers passage. Animals use it. People use it. Ideas may have moved through it, though ideas are much harder to trace than bones or tools. A person standing on one of its higher rises would not see a political border or a national coastline. They would see roots. A river corridor leading toward distant woodland. A line of animal movement across open ground. The glint of water in low marsh. Smoke from a small camp where another group has stopped for the season. In this older geography, connection is not an abstraction. It is a path underfoot. The climate is not gentle in the way modern comfort understands gentleness. Winters can be hard. Storms sweep across the lowlands. Cold rain makes fires precious. Insects rise thickly in wet seasons. The ground can betray the careless with mud, bog, or sudden channels. Yet compared with the frozen extremes that came before, this warming world can also be generous. Hazel produces nuts. Fish gather in rivers and estuaries. Birds nest in marshes. Deer move through woodland margins. Aurochs graze in open places, massive and dangerous, their presence turning the landscape into both food source and threat. Wild boar root beneath trees. Smaller animals leave tracks in soft ground. The people who live here do not need the land to be easy. They need it to be knowable. That knowledge is the real wealth of the drowned kingdom. Not gold, not walls, not fields of grain, but memory carried in bodies and habits. Where to find dry wood after rain, where flint nodules may be collected or exchanged, where river ice becomes unsafe, where salmon may run, if conditions allow, where deer cross at dawn, which plants can be eaten, which can heal, which can harm, how to read the sky before a storm, how to move quietly through reeds without sinking, how to return to a campsite after seasons away and know, from a bend in the river or a cluster of trees, that one has come home. Scholars still debate the exact rhythms of settlement across this landscape. Some groups may have used parts of Doggerland seasonally, moving through it as part of broad territories. Others may have returned repeatedly to favoured locations over many generations. Some places near rivers, lakes, or coasts would have drawn people again and again because they concentrated food and raw materials. There may have been small camps, temporary shelters, activity areas, burial places, and meeting points. Much of this is inferred from better preserved Mesolithic sites around the margins of the North Sea and from the artefacts recovered offshore. The sea has not given back enough to map ordinary life in full. Still, the pattern is not one of emptiness, and it is one of movement, adaptation, and deep familiarity. A lesser-known detail is that the floor of the North Sea has preserved not only isolated objects, but the buried shapes of former landscapes. Beneath layers of sediment, scientists have identified river channels, peat deposits, and landforms that help reconstruct the world before inundation. Peat is especially important because it forms in wet, oxygen-poor environments where plant remains can survive for long periods. In some places, ancient plant material records the transition from dry or freshwater conditions toward wetter, brackish, and marine environments. Pollen grains, tiny and easily overlooked, become witnesses. They show which plants grew there, how vegetation changed, and how the environment responded as climate and sea level shifted. The smallest traces sometimes preserve the largest transformations. Before the water comes fully, there must have been a long period when the people of the lowlands notice changes without necessarily seeing the final pattern. The sea does not announce itself as destiny. It appears first as altered drainage, wetter ground, salt in places where salt did not belong, new birds along tidal margins, fish where there were once only freshwater species, storms pushing farther inland. A coastline is not a line to people living at ground level. It is a zone of smells. Tides, mudflats, shells, reeds, channels, and risks. As that zone migrates, the world does not end all at once. It becomes confusing. For generations, that confusion may still be manageable. A camp is moved, a crossing is abandoned, a hunting route shifts inland. Families remember that a certain hollow has become marsh. People who live by observation do not need written science to understand that the land is changing, but they may not know the scale. No one standing beside a swollen river can see the full retreat of ice sheets far to the north. No one watching a salt marsh spread across a valley can measure global sea level rise. They know the change through local losses, through the failure of old knowledge, through the uneasy moment when a place remembered by elders no longer matches the place underfoot. This is why the Lost Kingdom matters before it is lost. Its disappearance is not meaningful only because the sea finally covers it. It is meaningful because it had already been a world of relationships. Humans knew its resources. Animals depended on its corridors, plants rooted in its soils, rivers carried sediment, fish, and stories of movement across it. The drowned land was not merely a bridge between Britain and Europe. It was a place in itself, with its own seasons and dangers, its own centres and edges, its own remembered pathways. Later, when water fills the basin and separates the shores, people will inherit the result without seeing the process. They will look across the sea and experience distance where their ancestors once experienced continuity. The modern mind sees the North Sea and thinks of ships, storms, fishing grounds, oil platforms, wind turbines, and cold horizons. The older mind would have seen a country of reeds, forests, game trails, freshwater pools, and smoke rising in the morning. The transformation between those two realities is the heart of the story. Before the waves erase it, Doggerland is not a mythic Atlantis gleaming with towers. It is something more fragile and more human, a landscape made meaningful by use. Memory, hunger, fear, skill, and return. Its people do not know they are living in a future seabed. They know only that the land feeds them, tests them, and keeps changing in ways their descendants may struggle to explain. A rich land between worlds does not need to look rich at first glance. It may not glitter, it may not rise in terraces or carry temples against the sky. Its wealth can be quieter, a river bend where fish gather in spring, a hazel grove that feeds people before winter, a dry ridge above flooded ground, a patch of good flint, a marsh where birds arrive in such numbers that the air seems to thicken with wings. Doggerland's abundance, if abundance is the right word, belongs to this older kind of economy. It is measured not in stored treasure, but in reliable returns. It is the wealth of places that people learn to trust. The people who move through this landscape live in a world before farming, before cattle pens, before grain fields become the foundation of villages and kingdoms. But that does not make their lives simple. The old idea of hunter-gatherers wandering randomly across empty wilderness has faded because archaeology shows something far more complex. Mesolithic communities know their territories deeply. They plan movement across seasons. They return to places where food appears at predictable times. They make tools suited to specific tasks. They use wood, bone, antler, hide, fibre, resin, stone, and fire with skill built over countless generations. What survives in the record is only a fraction of that knowledge, because many of the materials they use decay easily, but the surviving traces point toward lives shaped by intelligence, memory, and constant attention. Doggerland offers many kinds of attention to reward. Along rivers, fish can be taken with spears, traps, nets, weirs, or hooks, though the exact technologies used in every part of the drowned plain remain uncertain. In wetlands, water birds provide meat, feathers, eggs, and seasonal signals. In woodland and woodland edge, deer, boar, elk, and aurochs move through patterns that hunters learn over years, along shorelines, as the sea presses closer, seals, shellfish. And marine fish become part of the expanding world of opportunity. The changing environment is dangerous, but it is also productive. The same rising waters that destroy old places create new estuaries, mudflats, and tidal edges rich with food. No single explanation fully accounts for how every community responded, but the evidence suggests flexibility was essential. This flexibility may be one reason Doggerland becomes so important in the story of post-Ice Age Europe. It lies between regions that are now separated, and for a long time it allows people, animals, and perhaps traditions to pass through. Britain is not yet isolated as an island. Mainland Europe is not yet across a sea. The lowland between them is a corridor, but it is also more than a corridor. A corridor is something one merely crosses. Doggerland may have been a place where groups stayed, returned, met, hunted, exchanged materials, found partners, told stories, and buried memory into the ground. Scholars still debate how dense this activity was, because the sea is hidden or damaged so much, but even scattered artifacts reveal that the landscape was used. A flint blade found offshore is a small thing, almost unimpressive beside the ruins of later civilizations. Yet in the Mesolithic world, such an object carries a long chain of meaning. Someone selected raw material, struck it with care, shaped an edge, used it, carried it, repaired or discarded it. It may have cut meat, worked wood, scraped hide, prepared plant fibre, or formed part of a composite tool with a handle of bone or wood. A tiny microlith, set into an arrow or harpoon, might have helped bring down an animal that fed a family. A barbed antler point could belong to fishing or hunting in watery places. These objects are not decorations of a vanished culture. They are the working teeth of survival. The surprising detail is how much of this lost richness is known indirectly through modern disturbance. The North Sea has been heavily fished, dredged, drilled, surveyed, and engineered. Sand extracted from offshore areas has been used for coastal protection and construction. Sometimes that sand carries prehistoric material with it. Beaches in the Netherlands, especially places where sand from the seabed has been deposited, have yielded bones and tools from vanished landscapes. Fishermen have brought up remains of animals that once roamed dry land. What appears as an industrial accident becomes a message from prehistory. The Lost Kingdom speaks through dredging spoil, trawler nets, and seabed cores, a strange partnership between ancient silence and modern machinery. This makes the richness of Doggerland difficult to see in ordinary human terms. A later kingdom may be mapped by roads, walls, inscriptions, coins, and borders. Doggerland must be reconstructed from submerged topography, sediments, pollen, animal bones, and scattered artifacts. Its wealth has to be imagined from ecological possibility and archaeological comparison. The evidence remains incomplete, and caution matters. It would be easy to paint the drowned plain as a paradise. A green Eden erased by the sea, but that would be too smooth, too sentimental. The real landscape was likely uneven, sometimes harsh, sometimes abundant, sometimes dangerous, always changing. Its richness lay not in effortless plenty, but in diversity. If one resource failed, another might be found. If a river flooded, a ridge remained. If woodland thickened, edges opened elsewhere. If the sea ruined one place, it might create another for a time. Human groups living there would have built social life around that diversity. A season of fishing may bring people together near water. A hunt may require cooperation across several families. A good nut harvest may draw repeated visits to certain groves. The making of tools may depend on knowing where stone can be found or who has access to it. Burials, where they occur in Mesolithic Europe, suggest emotional and symbolic lives far richer than bones alone can explain. Bodies may be treated with care, placed with objects, or located in meaningful landscapes. Whether Doggerland itself held many such places is still uncertain, because the underwater record is so fragmentary. Yet it is hard to imagine people moving through a land for generations without attaching memory to particular bends, clearings, rises, and shores. The animals also shape the character of this world. Aurochs, the wild ancestors of domestic cattle, are not gentle cattle waiting to be tamed. They are huge, muscular, and potentially deadly, with sweeping horns and the confidence of animals that do not answer to human plans. Red deer move through the forest edge with an elegance that hides the difficulty of hunting them. Wild boar can vanish into cover and turn dangerous when pressed. Birds fill wetlands with sound and movement. Fish run through channels that change with season and water level. The human relationship with these animals is not one of dominance in the later agricultural sense. It is negotiation. People track, wait, follow, imitate, avoid, and strike when the moment allows. Water is the deepest force in that negotiation. Long before the final drowning, water makes the land rich. It carries fish, it feeds plants, it draws animals, it creates travel routes by boat or along banks. It preserves tracks in mud and erases them with the next flood. It opens the landscape and divides it. A river can be a road, a boundary, a food source, and a danger in the same day. As the climate warms and sea level rises, the balance changes. Freshwater systems become increasingly influenced by tides in some areas. Marshes expand, estuaries deepen, salt begins to enter old worlds. This transformation is not only geological, it changes the menu of life. It changes where people can sleep, where animals appear, which plants thrive, and which paths are safe. The richness of Doggerland, then, is inseparable from its vulnerability. The same low relief that makes broad wetlands possible also leaves the land exposed to rising seas. The same rivers that sustain life become channels through which salt water can intrude. The same marshes that attract birds and fish can become difficult barriers. The same openness that allows movement between Britain and Europe gives the sea room to advance. What makes the place valuable also makes it fragile. And this fragility would not have been abstract to those who lived there. It would have appeared in daily decisions. Where should the shelter stand this season? Whether the old camp remains dry enough, whether the crossing can still be used, whether the animals have shifted their route, whether the children can be brought safely through a wetland that elders remember as firmer ground. These choices are small only from a distance. Together they form the human experience of environmental change. So Doggerland's lost wealth cannot be counted in monuments. It lies in the living relationships between people, animals, plants, water, and memory. It was a land that connected shores, fed communities, and taught generations to read an unstable world. It may never have been a kingdom of rulers, but it was a kingdom of signs, a place where survival depended on noticing everything. And as the sea continued to rise, that talent for noticing would become both more necessary and more painful. Because the people of the drowned plain were not merely watching nature change, they were watching the familiar foundations of their world begin to slip away. The people of the drowned plain leave no names behind, but they are not faceless. They appear in the record through the things hands can make, the food bodies can gather, the roots feet can remember, and the marks a life leaves when the material world happens to preserve them. They are Mesolithic people, living after the great ice sheets begin to release their grip, and before farming reshapes the European landscape. They belong to a time often described by what it lacks: no writing, no cities, no metal, no domesticated herds in the later agricultural sense. Yet that way of describing them misses almost everything that matters. Their world is not primitive emptiness, it is a dense field of knowledge. A person waking on Doggerland might know the season before opening the shelter flap, simply from sound and air. The calls of birds from the wetland, the quality of cold in the dawn, the smell of river mud, the insects rising or absent, the movement of animals beyond camp, all of these are information. A community that survives here does not separate nature from life. The landscape is not scenery. It is calendar, pantry, map, warning system, and memory. The people living on this plain must understand wood, water, weather, stone, bone, hide, fire, and movement with a precision that later societies often forget they have lost. Their shelters are probably light, practical, and made from materials that rarely survive branches: skins, bark, reeds, grasses, perhaps frames that can be repaired or moved. Some camps may last only days, others may be returned to us across seasons or generations. A good place is not chosen randomly. It may sit near fresh water, dry ground, animal paths, fish runs, fuel, and visibility across open land. It may be close enough to a river to use its resources, but not so close that flooding becomes constant danger. The evidence remains incomplete, especially beneath the North Sea, but Mesolithic sites around northwestern Europe suggest flexible settlement patterns rather than permanent villages in the later farming sense. People move because movement is intelligence. They follow the life of the land. In the morning, tasks divide not by modern categories, but by need, skill, age, and experience. Someone checks tools. Someone tends fire. Someone prepares food left from the previous day. Someone repairs binding on a spear or replaces a small flint blade set into a wooden shaft. Someone watches children old enough to learn but young enough to wander into danger. Someone studies tracks near soft mud. The entire camp is a workshop, kitchen, school, and lookout. Objects are used until they wear out. Reshaped when possible, discarded when not. Nothing is simple because everything useful has a history of making behind it. Stone tools survive best, so they dominate the archaeological imagination. But in life, they are only part of a larger technology. Flint edges may cut, scrape, pierce, and shape. Antler and bone can become points, barbs, needles, wedges, and handles. Wood, though usually vanished, is essential shafts, bows, paddles, digging sticks, stakes, frames, containers, perhaps fish traps or structures in wet ground. Plant fibres can bind, net, carry, and repair. Resin and pitch can glue. Hide can shelter and clothe. The people of Doggerland likely live surrounded by technologies that the sea and soil have mostly erased. What survives in the record suggests only the harder skeleton of a much richer material world. Food gathering is not a single activity but a constant choreography. Hunting large animals brings risk and reward. Red deer offer meat, hide, bone, antler, sinew, and symbolic importance. Wild boar are valuable but dangerous. Aurochs, massive and powerful, are not simply prey. They are a force in the landscape, approached with caution and perhaps awe. Smaller animals, birds, fish, shellfish, nuts, berries, roots, seeds, and greens all matter. The idea of a heroic hunter standing alone at the centre of life is too narrow. Survival depends on broad diets and many hands. Gathering can be as skilled as hunting. Fishing can be as technical as making weapons. Knowing when not to pursue an animal may be as important as courage. One lesser-known feature of Mesolithic life is the sophistication of watery technology in parts of northern Europe. Evidence from comparable sites shows that people could make fish traps, use dugout canoes, and create tools suited to wetland and coastal environments. Not every technique can be proven for every part of Doggerland, and scholars still debate how widely particular practices spread. But the broader pattern is clear: these were not people helpless before water. They used water, travelled along it, harvested from it, and understood its moods. That makes the later drowning more tragic, not less. The force that helps sustain them also becomes the force that slowly removes the ground beneath their lives. Social life leaves even fainter marks, but it must have been rich. People do not survive harsh and changing environments as isolated individuals. They require kinship, cooperation, teaching, sharing, memory, and trust. Groups may meet at certain times of year, exchange materials, form partnerships, settle disputes, and renew bonds. Children learn by watching and doing, absorbing the landscape through repeated movement. Elders carry knowledge of past winters, past floods, old animal routes. And places now altered, the dead may remain present in memory and perhaps in burial places, though direct evidence from the drowned plain is scarce. Across Mesolithic Europe, burials show care, variation, and symbolic behaviour. Bodies are sometimes placed with objects, ochre, animal parts, or deliberate arrangement. The evidence does not allow easy generalisation, but it makes one thing clear: these communities carried emotional worlds as complex as any later people. Their beliefs are harder still to reconstruct. No single explanation fully accounts for how Mesolithic people understood animals, death, weather, water, or landscape. It would be irresponsible to invent a neat religion for them, yet it would be equally wrong to imagine that they lived without meaning. People who depend so closely on animals often develop rich ways of thinking about them. People who move through repeated places often attach memory and significance to landforms. People who bury their dead carefully do not treat life as mere survival. The details are gone, but the outlines of meaning remain visible in care, repetition, and choice. The changing environment presses into the social world. The first signs may be subtle: a campsite too wet in spring, a fish species appearing in a place where it was once rare, a line of trees dying where salt reaches their roots, a storm tide that pushes farther into the low ground than elders expect. These are not abstract climate events. They become arguments about where to camp, when to move, what routes remain safe, which memories still hold true, in a world without written maps. Environmental change attacks memory itself. A path taught by a parent may no longer lead where it once led. A dry place becomes marsh. A freshwater pool becomes brackish. A familiar animal path disappears. The people of Doggerland are therefore not passive victims in a doomed landscape. They are active, observant, capable, and adaptive. They adjust their movements. They exploit new wetlands and shorelines. They likely shift toward more aquatic resources in some places as the coast advances. They maintain connections where possible and abandon places when necessary. But adaptation has limits. When change continues across generations, the cost accumulates. Each adjustment saves the present while narrowing the future. The land that once connected communities begins to fragment. Distance grows. The map inside people's minds must be redrawn again and again. This is the human centre of the drowned kingdom, not a throne room, but a campfire on low ground, not royal law, but shared memory, not a written chronicle, but a child learning where the safe crossing used to be. The people of Doggerland live by reading signs, and for a long time that knowledge gives them power. Yet the greatest sign of all is also the hardest to interpret while living inside it. The water is rising. It rises through rivers, marshes, estuaries, storms, and tides. It rises into stories told by elders and into choices made by families. It rises slowly enough to be survived, but steadily enough to erase a world. The sea does not begin as an enemy. For a long time, it is simply distant, held beyond the low horizon, separated from the inner plains by miles of land, river valleys, marshes, and rising ground. People living across Doggerland may know coastal places, tidal smells, shellfish beds, and storms, but the sea is only one part of a wider world. It is not yet the ruler of the landscape. Then the climate continues to warm, the great ice sheets continue to melt, and water stored for millennia in frozen form returns to the oceans. The change is not a single flood sweeping neatly across a map. It is a planetary rebalancing, slow by the measure of one day, immense by the measure of human generations. At the end of the last ice age, the Earth is recovering from a colder state. Ice sheets shrink across northern Europe and beyond. Glaciers release meltwater. Oceans rise. Land that had been pressed down by ice begins to rebound in some places, while other areas respond differently. Coastlines shift in complicated ways. Doggerland, low and shallow, is especially vulnerable. Its rivers, wetlands, and plains exist in a basin that does not stand far above the advancing water. What survives in the record suggests that the drowning unfolded unevenly, with some areas lost earlier, some persisting as higher ground, and some transforming into marshes, lagoons, estuaries, and islands before finally disappearing beneath the North Sea. This is the slow betrayal of the sea it gives before it takes. As it pushes inland, it creates new edges full of life. Estuaries can be rich places, tidal flats can feed birds and shellfish, brackish waters can hold fish, seals may appear along new shores. For human communities skilled in water, these changing margins are not only threats, they are opportunities. A group may return to a newly productive inlet and find food where there was once only meadow. A river mouth may become a better fishing place, a wetland may draw birds in greater numbers. The first stages of drowning may therefore look less like collapse and more like transformation. But transformation has direction. The new edges keep moving. A place that is useful for one generation may be gone in the next. A campsite set back from water becomes shoreline. A shoreline becomes tidal mud. Tidal mud becomes shallow sea. The difference between adaptation and loss depends on whether there is somewhere else to go. And for a time there is. People can move inland, uphill, along rivers, toward remaining ridges, toward what will become Britain or mainland Europe. They can change routes, diets, and seasonal patterns. They can absorb loss into movement, yet every retreat leaves something behind: a fire pit, a memory, a burial, a stand of trees, a crossing, a story tied to a place that children will never see in the same form. Scholars still debate how quickly different parts of Doggerland became uninhabitable, partly because sea level rise is not uniform, and partly because the surviving evidence is patchy. Some models suggest large areas remained exposed for many centuries after surrounding lower ground flooded. Dogger Bank, now a shallow sandbank beneath the North Sea, may have existed for a time as an island or archipelago after much of the surrounding land had drowned. Other regions likely became wetlands first. Neither fully land nor fully sea, the human experience of this would have been complicated. People may not have thought in terms of a continent sinking. They may have known only that familiar places were becoming wetter, saltier, more broken, and more difficult to cross. One lesser-known detail is that sea level rise after the Ice Age did not proceed at a perfectly steady pace. There were pulses, pauses, regional differences, and sudden events superimposed on longer trends. Faraway changes in ice sheets could influence local coastlines, meltwater pulses could speed the rise, storms could reshape low shores dramatically, rivers, carrying sediment through the plain, could build or abandon channels. In such a world, the sea's advance may have felt irregular. Years of relative stability might be followed by a storm season that destroys a known camp or opens a new channel. A person could live long enough to see meaningful change, even if the full drowning required many generations. The older rivers become central to this process. Rivers do not simply vanish when seas rise. They slow, widen, back up, shift course, and become tidal in their lower reaches. Freshwater valleys become corridors for marine influence. Salt moves inland, plants change, trees that cannot tolerate brackish conditions die. Peat begins to form in some wet areas, preserving plant remains that later help scientists reconstruct the transition. Fish communities alter, birds respond. Animals that once crossed dry valleys may be forced toward narrower passages or higher land. Human groups following them must adjust. A river that once guided travel may become a barrier at certain tides. A ford may disappear. A boat may become more useful than a footpath. The emotional weight of such change is difficult to prove and impossible to measure, but it is not difficult to understand. Human beings attach memory to place. A bend in a river is not just geography if it is where a parent taught a child to spear fish. A grove is not just vegetation if families return there when nuts ripen. A rise above the marsh is not just dry ground if the dead are remembered there. As water enters these places, the loss is more than practical. It is an erosion of memory's anchor points. The evidence remains incomplete. But what can be inferred from human life in any landscape is that disappearance is felt first as disruption to ordinary routines. The sea's advance also changes relationships between groups. When land is broad, movement can be flexible. When dry ground narrows, routes concentrate. People may encounter one another more often at remaining crossings, high places, resource zones, or shorelines. This could create exchange and cooperation, but also tension. No direct evidence allows a simple story of conflict or harmony across Doggerland, and no single explanation fully accounts for how communities responded socially. Still, environmental pressure rarely acts only on the land, it acts on the spacing between people. It changes who meets whom, who has access to resources, and which paths remain open. In this long period of rising water, Britain's future isolation begins to take shape. The land connection to Europe weakens, narrows, and fragments. What was once a continuous terrain becomes a more difficult passage, then perhaps a chain of wetlands and islands, then open water. This process matters deeply for later history, but for the people living through it, the significance may have been immediate rather than grand. A journey once made overland now requires watercraft. A familiar route becomes dangerous. A neighbouring group becomes harder to reach. Marriage partners, exchange networks, hunting ranges, and seasonal gatherings may all be affected. The making of an island is also the unmaking of many human routes. There is a dry understatement in the geology of this catastrophe. Charts show curves, models show coastlines shifting through time, sediment cores show transitions from terrestrial plants to marine deposits, seismic maps reveal buried channels. These are calm forms of evidence, yet behind them lies the repeated human fact of having to leave, again and again. People must have recognised that certain places could not be used as before. Perhaps they returned after storms and found shelters destroyed. Perhaps they saw standing water where dry floors had been. Perhaps they carried tools, children, hides, food, and embers to higher ground, expecting to come back, then returned less often, then stopped. The sea's betrayal is slow because it allows hope. A flooded place may dry again. A bad season may be explained as unusual. A storm may be remembered as exceptional. A shoreline may seem stable for years. People are very good at surviving the present, and survival often requires treating change as local and temporary until it can no longer be denied. Over centuries, that habit becomes tragic. The land is not merely suffering events, it is moving toward a different state. Doggerland is becoming seabed. And still, life continues. Fires are lit. Fish are caught. Tools are sharpened. Children are born into a world already smaller than the world their grandparents knew. They learn new edges as if those edges have always been there. They inherit adaptation as normal life. Perhaps that is the most haunting part of the drowned kingdom. Its end is not experienced by one generation as a complete before and after. It is divided among many lives. Each sees only a portion of the loss. Each adjusts. Each remembers something older. Then one day, after enough generations, the land that once joined worlds survives only as islands, shoals, stories, and finally the hidden shape beneath the sea. As the sea presses farther into the lowlands, the rivers are among the first to lose their old identities. They do not vanish in a dramatic instant. They continue to flow, but the direction of power changes. Once they carried fresh water outward across the plain, gathering rain, snowmelt, silt, fish, fallen leaves, and the memory of upland places. Now the sea begins to answer back. Tides push into lower valleys. Salt reaches places that had known only river water. Banks soften. Channels widen. The old clean division between river and sea becomes blurred, and in that blur the landscape changes its character. A river valley in Doggerland is not merely a line of water. It is a route, a feeding ground, a boundary, a landmark, and a place where life gathers. People follow rivers because rivers simplify movement through difficult country. Animals come to drink, fish move along them, trees grow differently along their banks, gravel bars, muddy shallows, reeds, pools, and crossings all provide small opportunities that skilled communities learn over time. A river also gives orientation. In a world without written maps, a bend, a ford, a tributary, or a distinctive stand of trees can guide memory across distance. When such a river begins turning into an estuary, the change reaches far beyond the water itself. The first signs may be almost invisible to anyone not paying attention, but Mesolithic people survive by paying attention. A pool tastes faintly different. Certain plants retreat, others appear. The mud smells sharper. Fish behave in unfamiliar ways. Dead wood collects where tides leave debris. Birds that favour brackish edges gather in greater numbers. The water rises and falls with a rhythm no longer explained by rain alone. A crossing remains passable at one hour and dangerous at another. The river has not stopped being useful, but it has become less obedient to old knowledge. What survives in the record suggests these transformations were widespread across low-lying coastal zones after the Ice Age. In submerged landscapes like Doggerland, sediment cores and buried peat can show transitions from freshwater marsh to salt marsh or marine conditions. Pollen reveals changing vegetation. Diatoms and other microscopic remains may point towards shifts in salinity. These scientific traces are tiny, but they describe a world being remade from the roots upward. Trees that once held the banks may die when salt reaches them. Reed beds shift. Peat grows in waterlogged areas. They may be buried beneath marine sand or mud. The land keeps a layered memory of becoming sea. For the people living there, these layers would not have looked like geology. They would have looked like practical trouble. A place where shelter stood safely for years might become too damp. A riverside camp might attract more insects, more flooding, more unstable ground. Firewood could become harder to keep dry. Tracks might disappear under tidal mud. Hunting along a valley might become more difficult if animals change their routes. Boats, where used, might open new possibilities. But not every burden can be solved by water travel. Children, elders, food stores, tools, hides, and embers still have to be moved, protected, and kept dry. There is also danger in ground that seems familiar but is no longer trustworthy. Estuaries create mudflats, channels, sandbanks, and marsh edges that can shift quickly. A person crossing at the wrong time may be trapped by tide or soft sediment. Fog over wet ground can erase distance. Storm surges can push saltwater far inland. The low relief of Doggerland means that small changes in water level may spread widely. A rise that once looked safely above the valley floor may become an island after heavy weather. A path between two camps may require waiting for the tide, detouring around new channels, or abandoning the route entirely. Scholars still debate how much of Doggerland was occupied continuously, and how much was used seasonally, but changing rivers would have affected both patterns. A group that returns each year to a fishing place may find the fish still there, but the banks altered. Another group that follows deer along a valley may discover the herd has shifted inland. A meeting place near a confluence may become harder to reach. A burial or remembered site may lie on ground now surrounded by marsh. The human map begins to fray not because people forget it, but because the land stops matching it. The transformation also changes the animals. Freshwater fish give way in some places to species tolerant of brackish conditions. Waterbirds exploit new wetlands. Seals may move into expanding coastal zones. Deer and boar adjust to shifting vegetation. Aurochs may avoid increasingly wet or broken terrain, or use remaining open areas differently. None of this can be reconstructed in perfect local detail for every lost valley, and the evidence remains incomplete. But ecology has its logic. Change the water and everything that drinks, roots, swims, nests, hunts, or hides near it must respond. Humans are part of that response, not outside it. For a time, the new estuaries may be wonderfully productive. This is one of the great contradictions of the drowned world. Environmental loss can arrive wearing the mask of abundance. Tidal margins are rich. Fish, shellfish, birds, reeds, and marine mammals can offer new resources. A community able to exploit them may not experience the first stages of change as pure disaster. The shoreline advances, but it also feeds. The people of Doggerland may adapt their tools, movements, and expectations to this new watery frontier. They may come to know tides as well as they once knew river floods. They may follow the edge of the sea as it moves inland, because the edge itself is alive with food. Yet the bargain is unstable. Estuaries migrate. Salt marsh can become open water. Channels deepen. Storms cut through weak ground. The rich edge does not stay where people need it to stay. It keeps withdrawing, shifting, breaking the land into smaller pieces. What seems at first like a new opportunity slowly reveals itself as a stage in disappearance. The sea gives fish and takes forests. It gives shellfish and takes camps. It gives birds and takes crossings. It offers a living margin while erasing the plain behind it. This slow reshaping likely changes the sound of the world. A freshwater valley has one voice running water, insects, leaves, animals moving through brush. An estuary has another, gulls and waders, sucking mud, tidal channels, wind across reeds, the distant crash of water where storms meet shallows. The smell changes too. Salt, rotting seaweed, wet peat, shell beds, brackish pools, fish, and tidal mud replace some of the older scents of inland riverbank and forest floor. Such details leave few direct traces, yet they matter because humans remember through senses. The drowned kingdom disappears not only in maps, but in sounds and smells no longer attached to land. As rivers turn into estuaries, Doggerland becomes more fragmented. The old plain is divided by water fingers reaching inward. Dry ground persists, but routes between dry places grow more complicated. Communities may gather along the new margins, then retreat from them. Some may move west toward Britain, others east or south toward the continental coast. Others remain on higher ground as long as it supports life. No single explanation fully accounts for all human choices across such a broad and changing region. The choices would have differed by season, resource, memory, risk, and relationship. But the general direction is unmistakable. The land is becoming less continuous. In this broken geography, memory becomes both guide and burden. Elders may remember when a wide channel was a narrow stream. Parents may describe a grove that no longer stands. Children may grow up treating tidal water as normal, where older generations remember fresh water. The same place holds different meanings depending on age. To one person it is a dangerous new marsh. To another it is the only shoreline they have known. In that difference, the drowning of Doggerland becomes generational. The world does not simply end, it is revised, inherited, revised again, and finally forgotten as land. The rivers that once held the plain together become the first corridors of its unmaking. They invite the sea inland, not by intention, but by shape. Their valleys provide paths for salt, tide, storm, sediment, and change. And along their banks, people continue to live as people always do in unstable times, watching, moving, remembering, arguing with necessity, finding food, protecting children, keeping fire alive. The tragedy is not that they fail to understand the land. The tragedy is that they understand it deeply, and still the land becomes something else. Then comes the kind of disaster that breaks the patience of slow change. For generations, the sea has been rising, reshaping valleys, widening estuaries, turning old ground into marsh and inlet. People have adapted because the changes, though serious, belong to the rhythm of lived time. A camp moves, a route changes, a shoreline creeps inland, but somewhere far to the north, beyond the daily world of the drowned plain, the seabed itself fails. A vast section of underwater sediment off the coast of Norway collapses and slides down the continental slope. The movement is immense, violent, and invisible from Doggerland until the water begins to answer. This event is known today as the Storegga Slide, one of the largest known submarine landslides of its kind. It happens around 8,200 years ago, long after the height of the Ice Age but before the final disappearance of every remnant of Doggerland. The slide displaces enormous volumes of water, sending tsunami waves outward across the Norwegian Sea and into the North Atlantic and North Sea. Along parts of the Norwegian coast, the wave leaves clear geological traces. In Scotland, deposits of sand and marine material found inland show that the tsunami reached shores with frightening force. Its effects across the remaining lowlands of Doggerland are harder to reconstruct, because much of the evidence lies underwater, disturbed, buried, or erased. Still, no serious telling of the drowned kingdom can ignore it. The tsunami does not create the whole drowning of Doggerland. That is important. It is tempting to imagine a single apocalyptic wave wiping a lost kingdom from the map in one terrible day. Popular versions of the story sometimes lean toward that image because it is dramatic, clean, and easy to remember. But no single explanation fully accounts for the loss of the entire landscape. Sea level rise had already taken much of it, and the long transformation was well underway before the Storegga tsunami arrived. Yet the wave may have been devastating for surviving coastal communities, wetlands, estuaries, and low-lying islands. It may have turned a shrinking world into an abruptly broken one. To understand the horror of such a wave, it helps to forget the modern word tsunami for a moment, and imagine the event from ground level. The morning may begin like any other along the remaining shores and marshes. People tend fires, repair tools, check traps, follow tracks, watch birds, or move along tidal flats. The sea has its habits, and people who live near it know them. Then those habits fail. Water may withdraw in a strange and sudden way, exposing mud, fish, stones, and channels that should not be exposed. Birds may lift in alarm, the horizon changes, a low dark line appears where no such line belongs. The sound follows, perhaps first as a distant pressure, then as a roar. There is no written witness, and the evidence remains incomplete, so this scene must be imagined cautiously. But tsunamis have physical behaviours, and low coasts are vulnerable in predictable ways. A wave moving into shallow water slows, rises, and drives inland with immense force. It is not merely a wall of clear water, it carries sediment, broken wood, stones, peat, salt, uprooted vegetation, animal bodies, and debris torn from everything in its path. It fills channels and then overflows them. It surges across flats and marshes. It turns familiar ground into a moving weapon. On a low landscape already cut by estuaries and tidal waters, the reach could have been terrifying. People caught near the shore would have little time. Those on higher ground might survive by climbing, if higher ground is close enough. Those in marshes or tidal channels might have no clear route. Boats could be smashed or carried inland. Shelters made of wood, hide, reeds, and bark would offer almost no resistance. Fires would vanish. Food stores would be soaked or scattered. Freshwater sources could be contaminated by salt. Fish traps, tools, hides, carefully prepared materials, and places of memory could be destroyed in minutes. The wave's immediate violence would be followed by a quieter danger, cold, injury, hunger, disorientation, and the problem of where to go after the water withdraws. A lesser-known detail is that the Storegga event is tied in time to a broader period of environmental stress known as the 8.2 kilo-year event, a sudden cooling episode linked to changes in meltwater drainage and ocean circulation. The relationship between this climatic event, human life, and the tsunami is complex, and scholars still debate the exact effects in different regions. It would be too simple to say that climate change caused one neat catastrophe that ended Doggerland. But the timing matters because it reminds us that prehistoric communities did not face one kind of change at a time. Sea level, storms, temperature shifts, ecological changes, and sudden disasters could overlap. Survival required flexibility, but flexibility could be tested from many directions at once. For Doggerland, the Storegga tsunami may have struck a landscape already wounded by the long sea level rise. Much of the old plain was likely gone or reduced by then, perhaps leaving islands, banks, wetlands, and coastal margins. A wave crossing such terrain could scour some places, bury others, and leave deposits that later vanish under continued marine erosion. This makes the archaeological question difficult. If the tsunami devastated human occupation in parts of the remaining land, the evidence may not be easy to find. Organic materials decay, light structures disappear, later seas rework sediment, The disaster may have been enormous in human terms while leaving only scattered or ambiguous traces for modern science. That imbalance between experience and evidence is one of the deepest challenges in the story. A later city destroyed by eruption or war might leave collapsed walls, bodies, ash layers, inscriptions, and dramatic ruins. A Mesolithic camp struck by a tsunami on a low wetland may leave almost nothing recognisable. A family's entire world could be broken, and the record might preserve only a layer of sand, a displaced log, a broken tool, or nothing at all. The absence of evidence is not proof of absence, but it also cannot be filled with certainty. The honest position is uneasy. The wave was real, its regional impact was significant, and its precise human consequences across Doggerland remain debated. Still, the possibility is haunting. Imagine survivors returning to a place where the geography has been rearranged. The channel is clogged with debris, the old bank is cut away, dead fish lie among branches, a stand of trees has been stripped or toppled, the smell of salt reaches inland, bodies of animals may be found in places they would never normally lie. The quiet after the wave may be worse than the roar because it reveals what has been removed. A practical people would begin at once with what survival demands count who remains. Find dry ground, recover tools, search for fresh water, make fire again, move away from danger. Grief would have to wait, or move alongside labour. For those who survived, the Storegga tsunami may have altered more than the land. It may have altered memory. Slow sea level rise can be absorbed into generational change, but a tsunami creates a before and after that fits human storytelling. People remember the day the sea came wrong. They remember the sound, the retreating water, the force, the loss of a camp, the dead, the ruined fresh water, the animals scattered across mud. They warn children about low shores. They mark certain places as dangerous. Over generations, such memories could fade, transform, or merge with wider traditions of floods and drowned lands. There is no direct line that can be proven from Doggerland to later flood legends. An unsupported claim should remain unsupported, but the human tendency to remember disaster through story is not in doubt. The great catastrophe offshore therefore sits at the centre of the drowned kingdom's mystery, not because it explains everything, but because it reveals how fragile the remaining world had become. A land can endure centuries of pressure, adapting inch by inch, and still be struck by a single event that accelerates loss beyond ordinary adjustment. The Storegga wave arrives not as the whole story, but as a brutal punctuation mark inside a longer sentence written by climate, ice, tide, and time. After the wave, Doggerland is still not necessarily gone in every remnant. Some higher areas may persist, some communities may continue nearby or return when they can. People are rarely erased as simply as landscapes are, but whatever remains has been warned in the harshest possible language. The sea is no longer only the patient force creeping into river valleys, it is also sudden violence from beyond sight, a power able to cross distance, climb land, and overturn the ordinary rules of the coast. The drowned kingdom has been shrinking for generations. Now it has also been struck. After the wave, survival begins in pieces, not as a heroic return to order, not as a clean rebuilding, but as a scattered effort to gather what the water has not taken. A person who lives through such a disaster does not first think in terms of prehistory, climate, geology, or the future map of Europe. The first concerns are immediate and small enough to hold in shaking hands dry wood, a cutting edge, a missing child, a wounded hunter, a skin soaked with salt, a fire that must be remade. A place high enough to sleep without hearing every movement of water as a warning. Catastrophe turns a landscape into tasks. The Storegga tsunami, where it struck, would not have affected every place in the same way. Low shorelines, estuaries, tidal flats, and marshes would be more exposed than higher ridges or inland ground. Some communities may have escaped the direct force because they were away from the coast, on higher land, or simply beyond the strongest reach of the wave. Others may have been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The evidence remains incomplete. So it is impossible to count the dead or map every human loss across Doggerland. Yet the physical nature of the event makes one thing clear for any group living on vulnerable low ground. The wave could have shattered ordinary life in a single day. The immediate aftermath would be disorienting because a tsunami does not merely wet the land, it rearranges it. Familiar paths may vanish beneath debris, mud can be torn away in one place and dumped in another, channels can be blocked or deepened, freshwater pools can become contaminated, animal carcasses, broken branches, uprooted trees, and marine sediment can lie far from where they belong. A camp built from light materials might leave little trace after such force. Hides, baskets, wooden frames, tools, stored food, bone points, hafts, fibres, and fire-making materials could be scattered, buried, or carried out with the retreating water. The practical damage would reach beyond the moment of impact. For hunter-gatherer fishers, mobility is a strength, but mobility also depends on equipment. A group can move if it has cutting tools, containers, clothing, knowledge of routes, and the physical condition to travel. Lose enough of those, and movement becomes harder. Injuries matter. Cold matters. Saltwater on clothing and bedding matters. The loss of fire can become a crisis, especially in a damp northern environment where dry fuel is difficult after flooding. People could make new tools, but not instantly, and not if raw materials are out of reach. They could find new food, but not if the nearest safe ground is already occupied, flooded, or unfamiliar. Survival after the wave would have depended not only on skill, but on what remained. What survives in the record suggests Mesolithic communities in northwestern Europe were highly adaptable, but adaptation should not be romanticised. It is often painful. A family forced to leave a ruined shoreline may need to enter another group's seasonal territory. A small band that has lost experienced adults may struggle to preserve knowledge. Children may survive but lose teachers. Elders may remember places that no longer exist. Groups may merge, split, relocate, or disappear from particular areas without leaving clear archaeological signatures. Scholars still debate the scale of occupation in Lake Doggerland, and no single explanation fully accounts for how people responded after the tsunami. But the range of possibilities includes both resilience and severe disruption. One lesser-known consequence of a marine inundation is the damage to fresh water. People can endure hunger for a time, but without drinkable water they must move quickly. A tsunami pushing salt water across low ground can foul pools, marsh edges, and shallow sources. It can leave behind brackish water in depressions, salt on vegetation, and dead organic matter that spoils what remains. Even after the visible flood withdraws, the landscape may no longer provide what it did before. A place that looks survivable may fail when people try to drink from it. The sea's violence continues through thirst. Animals would also be affected. Some are killed outright. Others flee, altering hunting patterns. Birds may return quickly to disturbed wetlands, but large mammals may avoid damaged or flooded areas. Fish traps, nets, and weirs, if present, could be destroyed. Shellfish beds may be buried or exposed. The food landscape after the wave would not simply reset, it would become unfamiliar. Skilled people can learn unfamiliar ground, but learning takes time. And the period after disaster rarely offers comfort or patience. In a world without written records, memory becomes the archive of catastrophe. Survivors would carry the wave in the body before it ever became a story. The sound, the pressure, the cold, the speed, the strange withdrawal of water, the helplessness of watching familiar ground vanish under a moving wall of debris. Later, memory might become warning. Do not camp too low. Do not trust the sea when it pulls away. Move quickly if the birds rise and the water behaves wrongly. Such lessons could save lives if passed on, though the precise words are gone. The evidence cannot prove the stories, but human beings have always used stories to store danger. The wave may also have changed how people thought about the remaining land. Before, the sea's advance might have seemed gradual, troublesome, but manageable. Afterward, the sea had shown another face. A shoreline was no longer merely a shifting resource zone. It was a place where an unseen force could arrive from beyond the horizon. This does not mean people abandoned all coast and terror. Coastal and estuarine places were too useful to ignore, and humans often return to dangerous places because those places feed them. But return after disaster is never the same as innocence. The landscape now carries fear as well as food. Some communities may have moved permanently toward higher ground. Others may have continued to use surviving coastal margins with greater caution. Some may have followed relatives or exchange partners toward Britain or the continental shore. As the remaining parts of Doggerland shrank, the options narrowed. A disaster that might once have been absorbed by moving across a broad plain becomes more severe when the plain has already been broken into islands, marshes, and ridges. Environmental pressure and sudden catastrophe compound one another. The tsunami does not need to destroy everything to change everything. Archaeology struggles to see these decisions clearly. A gap in evidence can mean many things people left. People stayed but left few durable traces. Later, erosion destroyed the traces, or the right places have not yet been found. Underwater landscapes are especially difficult because sediment moves, organic materials decay, and modern activity disturbs the seabed. Researchers must piece together human response through indirect clues, comparisons with better preserved sites, environmental reconstruction, and occasional artifacts recovered from offshore contexts. The result is a story with firm foundations and open spaces. The wave happened, sea levels rose, Doggerland shrank. People lived in and around this changing world. The exact human aftermath remains partly hidden. Yet hidden does not mean empty. It may be that the most important consequences left no objects at all. A marriage route cut off by water, a gathering place abandoned, a child raised in a new territory because the old one no longer held fresh water, a burial place lost to the tide, a group's knowledge becoming less useful because the land that shaped it no longer exists. These are historical events in human terms, even if they do not survive as museum pieces. They belong to the quiet record of displacement. After the wave, the drowned kingdom is no longer simply a place slowly losing ground, it is a wounded landscape. The sea has proven that it can arrive not only as a rising level, but as a sudden force. People continue, because people do. They make fire again if they can. They salvage tools, they search for the missing, they move toward higher land, they learn the new shape of rivers and shores, but each act of survival takes place inside a world that has become smaller, less certain, and more haunted. The Lost Kingdom has not fully vanished yet, but its future has narrowed. What remains now is a scattering of last refuges, last roots, and last memories, waiting for the final advance of the sea. After the long drowning and the sudden violence, the remaining land becomes a world of fragments. Doggerland is no longer the broad plain that once joined Britain to the continent. It is a broken geography of higher ground, marsh, shoal, island, tidal channel, and uncertain shore. The old routes that once crossed open country now end at water. The rivers that once guided movement have widened into estuaries or vanished into the sea. What had been a landscape of connection becomes a landscape of separation, and the people who still know it must live with a strange new fact. The world of their ancestors has not disappeared completely, but it can no longer be trusted to remain. The last islands of Doggerland are difficult to reconstruct in exact detail, because the evidence lies beneath the North Sea and has been disturbed by tides, storms, sediment movement, trawling, dredging, and modern engineering. Still, sea level models and submerged topography suggest that some higher areas persisted after much of the surrounding plain had flooded. Dogger Bank, now a shallow sandbank famous to fishermen and geologists, may once have stood above the water as part of this final landscape. It may have been an island or a set of islands for a time, surrounded by expanding sea. Scholars still debate the exact timing, shape, and habitability of these remnants. But the idea is powerful because it turns the end of Doggerland into something visible not one vanished continent, but a shrinking chain of refuges. To live on such a remnant would be to live inside a narrowing circle. The sea would be present in every direction, not always visible from every rise, but always near. Weather would matter more. Storm surges would carry greater danger. Fresh water would become precious. Animal populations would be smaller or more seasonal. Some large mammals might no longer support regular hunting on isolated ground. Plants would change under the pressure of salt, wind, and wetness. Human groups could still use such islands, perhaps seasonally, perhaps as temporary camps, perhaps as familiar places reached by boat. But long-term life would become more complicated. What survives in the record suggests possibility, not certainty. An island is not merely land surrounded by water, it changes the mind. On a broad plain, distance can be crossed by walking. On an island, every journey outward depends on weather, craft, timing, and risk. A neighbouring group may be close by sight but difficult to reach. A storm can turn a short crossing into a fatal barrier. Children grow up with the edge of the world made visible by water. Elders may remember when that edge was farther away, when a person could walk where waves now break. Their memories would make the island larger than its actual size. The young would inherit stories of places that sounded both real and impossible. This is where the Lost Kingdom begins to become memory, even before it becomes legend. A family might know that beyond a shallow channel there was once a line of trees. An old hunter might describe a deer route now drowned. A woman might remember gathering hazelnuts where only tidal water remains. A burial place may lie beyond reach, or beneath water, or at the edge of a crumbling bank. Such memories are not mythology at first. They are ordinary grief, ordinary knowledge, ordinary comparison between what was and what is. But as generations pass and the land continues to shrink, ordinary memories can harden into stories about a former world. The last islands also reveal the difference between survival and continuity. People may survive by leaving, a community may endure by moving to Britain or the continental coast, merging with relatives, finding new hunting grounds, adapting to new shores. But the landscape itself does not survive in the same way. The name, the routes, the seasonal rounds, the exact relationship between people and place, all of these can break even if descendants live on elsewhere. This is one of the quiet tragedies of environmental loss. A people need not vanish biologically for a world to end. Sometimes the world ends when the place that organised memory disappears. A lesser-known detail is that submerged prehistoric landscapes around the North Sea are not always barren after drowning. In some places, rapid burial under sediment may preserve ancient surfaces, peat, tree remains, and organic traces better than ordinary dry land would have done. The same sea that destroys visibility can sometimes protect hidden layers from later ploughing, building, or erosion on land. This creates a strange paradox. Doggerland is lost because water covers it, but parts of its story may survive because water and sediment sealed them away. The difficulty is reaching them, identifying them, and interpreting them before modern activity or natural erosion damages them. For the people of the final islands, however, preservation for future science would mean nothing. Their concern is whether the ground holds. Each year may bring familiar tasks under less familiar conditions. Fishing may become more important. Boats may be repaired more carefully. Storm signs may be watched with greater anxiety. Camps may shift toward the highest places, but the highest places may not offer the best food. Fresh water pools may shrink or become brackish. If the island is used seasonally, visits may become shorter, more dangerous. Then cease. If people attempt to stay longer, they must solve problems of food, water, fuel, shelter, and social connection in a landscape increasingly defined by limits. No single explanation fully accounts for the final abandonment. It may not have been a single decision, and it may not have happened everywhere at once. Some groups may leave after a major storm. Others may stop returning because the journey is no longer worth the risk. Some may be forced away by saltwater intrusion, loss of game, lack of fresh water, or erosion. Some may retain memory of the place long after daily use ends. In archaeology, abandonment can look sudden from a distance because the evidence thins. In life, it may be slow, full of hesitation, return, regret, and practical necessity. The final submergence is not necessarily dramatic in the way imagination expects. There may be no last crowd watching the last hill disappear beneath a single wave. More likely, there are many endings. A camp not rebuilt, a crossing no longer attempted, a fishing place visited one final season without anyone knowing it is final. A storm that cuts away part of a bank, a freshwater pool spoiled beyond use, a high ridge becoming too exposed and too small. The last island becomes a shoal. The shoal becomes a hazard beneath waves. The hazard becomes a feature on a seabed map thousands of years later, its human meaning stripped away by time. And yet, memory may have lingered along the new coasts. Communities in Britain and continental Europe could have carried stories of drowned ground, dangerous waters, former routes, and places where ancestors once moved. It is impossible to draw a direct, proven line from these memories to later flood legends. The evidence does not allow that certainty, but it is reasonable to recognise that human memory can preserve environmental change in transformed ways. People remember lost places because lost places matter. Over generations, details fade, but the emotional shape remains. There was land where there is now water. By the time the North Sea takes the last visible remnants, the great transformation is complete. Britain has become an island. The old lowland corridor is gone. The animals, plants, rivers, and human paths of Doggerland now lie beneath moving water. The sea that once approached through estuaries now owns the basin. Waves pass over valleys. Fish move above former camps. Storms stir sand over places where people may have slept, worked, argued, taught, grieved, and watched the weather. The last islands of memory sink into a silence deeper than ruin, because ruins at least stand where they can be seen. Doggerland disappears into a kind of absence that must be rediscovered before it can even be mourned. For thousands of years after the last visible pieces of Doggerland disappear, the North Sea keeps its secret in plain sight. Ships cross above it. Storms roll over it. Fish move through its drowned valleys. Sandbanks shift under tides. To people on the coasts, the sea becomes a border, a danger, a livelihood, and a horizon. It no longer looks like a place where forests stood or where rivers once wound through misty lowlands. The old land has been translated into water so completely that the human mind stops expecting it to have been anything else. Then, slowly and strangely, the sea begins returning fragments. The first messengers are often not archaeologists. They are fishermen, dredging crews, beachcombers, and workers whose lives touch the seabed without setting out to solve prehistory. Nets drag up bones far from any modern shore. Antlers appear where no deer could live. Mammoth teeth, aurochs bones, and prehistoric animal remains come from waters that seem too deep, too cold, too clearly marine to belong to a vanished land. At first, such finds may look like curiosities, oddities from the bottom. But when enough of them appear, curiosity hardens into a pattern. The North Sea floor begins to look less like an empty basin and more like a buried archive. Fishermen working the southern North Sea have long recovered bones and artefacts from the seabed. Some are the remains of Ice Age animals, including mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, horse, giant deer, and other species that once moved across exposed land. Others belong to later animals and human activity. A bone or antler tool, a worked flint, a harpoon point, or a fragment shaped by human hand changes the meaning of the find. It is one thing to learn that animals once roamed where the sea now lies. It is another to realise people did too. What survives in the record suggests not merely a natural landscape, but a lived one. The modern rediscovery of Doggerland gathers force because several worlds of evidence begin to meet. Archaeologists study artefacts, geologists study sediments, paleoenvironmental scientists examine pollen, plant remains, peat, and microfossils. Marine surveyors map the seabed. The oil and gas industry, searching for resources beneath the North Sea, collects seismic data that later becomes unexpectedly valuable for reconstructing buried landscapes. Sound waves sent into the seabed reveal channels, ridges, basins, and surfaces hidden below layers of sediment. A vanished country begins to reappear as lines, shadows, and contours on screens. There is something almost ironic in this. The ancient land is rediscovered partly through the machinery of a modern industrial sea, trawlers, dredgers, pipelines, drilling surveys, wind farm investigations, and coastal engineering disturb or scan the places where the old world lies. Some of this activity threatens fragile evidence. Some of it exposes evidence that would otherwise remain unknown. The result is uneasy but fruitful. The same modern age that risks damaging submerged prehistory also provides tools powerful enough to detect it. Scholars still debate how best to protect such landscapes, because underwater heritage is difficult to see, difficult to monitor, and easy to lose before anyone knows it is there. A lesser-known but important part of this rediscovery comes from beaches where sand taken from offshore deposits has been brought onto land. In the Netherlands, especially on artificial or replenished beaches, prehistoric bones and artefacts have sometimes been found by collectors and researchers after dredged sand is spread across the shore. The objects arrive out of context, separated from the exact places where they originally lay, which limits what can be known from them. Yet they still matter. A flint tool carried from the seabed to a modern beach is a displaced clue, a small stone witness that the drowned plane contained human action. It is not enough by itself to rebuild a camp, but it is enough to prove a human presence. The difficulty is context. Archaeology depends not only on objects, but on where objects are found, how they lie, what surrounds them, what layers cover them, and what other traces appear nearby. A flint blade found in a fisherman's net has lost much of its setting. A bone from dredged sand may have travelled from its original position. A tool on a beach may tell us that people were somewhere offshore, but not exactly where or how they lived. This is why submerged landscape archaeology is so careful and slow. The evidence remains incomplete not because the past was empty, but because the conditions of recovery are so difficult. Still, when objects are joined with landscape mapping, the picture sharpens. Seismic surveys can reveal ancient river channels, lake basins, and land surfaces. Sediment cores can test what those mapped features represent. If a core brings up peat, pollen, or freshwater deposits from a buried valley, it confirms that the area was once land or wetland rather than sea. If those layers can be dated, researchers can place the landscape within a timeline of rising water, bit by bit. The invisible ground gains history. A buried channel is no longer just a shape. It becomes a river at a certain moment, in a certain environment, with plants growing nearby and perhaps people moving along it. The most powerful reconstructions of Doggerland are therefore not based on fantasy or wishful thinking, but on patient combinations of evidence. Bathymetry shows the shape of the seabed. Seismic data shows buried features. Cores reveal sediments and biological remains. Radiocarbon dating helps build chronology. Artifacts and animal bones show human and ecological presence. Comparisons with better preserved Mesolithic sites around the North Sea margins help fill, cautiously, some gaps in daily life. No single piece proves everything. Together they form a landscape that cannot be dismissed as legend. And yet, the mystery remains partly out of reach. Underwater archaeology is expensive, weather-dependent, and technically demanding. Visibility can be poor, currents are strong, sediments move, sites may be deeply buried, scattered, or eroded. Organic remains may survive in some places and vanish in others. Modern trawling can drag material across the seabed. Dredging can remove layers. Offshore construction can reveal or destroy ancient surfaces. Researchers must often work from fragments. Probabilities, and models rather than open excavation of large settlements. The drowned kingdom resists the neatness of land archaeology. This resistance gives Doggerland its strange atmosphere. It is at once one of the best supported lost landscapes in Europe, and one of the hardest to walk through imaginatively with confidence. Scientists can map valleys beneath the sea, but they cannot yet show every campfire. They can recover tools, but not the voices around them. They can identify drowned forests and ancient channels, but not the names given to them. They can show that people lived in this changing world, but not exactly how each family experienced its loss. The record suggests presence, movement, adaptation, and disappearance. The intimate texture must be approached carefully, never claimed too strongly. Still, each find changes the modern relationship with the North Sea. A body of water once treated as separation becomes evidence of former connection. The gap between Britain and Europe is revealed as historically recent in deep time. The seabed becomes a buried landscape rather than empty space. Even the word offshore begins to feel misleading, because for much of human prehistory this was not off the shore at all. It was the shore, the inland, the river plain, the hunting ground. The place between fires. There is a quiet drama in the fact that Doggerland is discovered backward. Its people did not leave monumental signs for later ages to admire. Modern researchers first see the end state the sea, and then work beneath it toward the vanished beginning. They begin with absence and reconstruct presence. They begin with scattered bones and map a country. They begin with a fishing net full of impossible remains and uncover the memory of rivers. This is archaeology as reversal. Pulling land out of water without draining a drop. The traces beneath the North Sea do not restore the lost kingdom, but they change its silence. They show that the sea has not erased everything. Beneath the waves are buried valleys, peat beds, animal remains, tools, and sediments that still hold the shape of a human world. The evidence is fragmentary, debated, and often difficult, but it is enough to make the modern horizon unstable. The next time the North Sea looks endless and permanent, it carries another image beneath it. A low plain in morning mist, a river turning through reeds, a flint edge in someone's hand, and a landscape waiting thousands of years to be recognised again. Calling Doggerland a lost kingdom is both useful and dangerous. It is useful because the phrase gives emotional weight to what disappeared. It reminds the listener that this was not an empty shelf of mud or a geological accident without human meaning. It was a broad inhabited world, rich in rivers, animals, plants, roots, camps, memories, and repeated returns. It was large enough to join lands that later ages would treat as separate. It was important enough that its disappearance reshaped the geography of northwestern Europe. In that sense, the language of a lost kingdom helps the mind feel the scale, but it is dangerous because it can smuggle in the wrong picture thrones. Palaces, walls, kings, organised borders, and a dramatic capital swallowed by the waves. Nothing in the mainstream evidence supports that kind of kingdom. The people of Doggerland lived thousands of years before the rise of the later states and monarchies that make the word kingdom familiar. They were Mesolithic hunter-gatherer fishers, not subjects of a crowned ruler in a stone hall. Their political life, if that word can even be used comfortably, was probably organised through kinship, small groups, seasonal gatherings, alliances, obligations, memory, and negotiation rather than centralised rule. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the size and structure of Mesolithic social networks in different regions. But there is no reason to imagine a single government ruling the drowned plain. Doggerland was not Atlantis with antler tools. It was something older, subtler, and in many ways more interesting. This distinction matters because the real mystery does not need exaggeration. A landscape can be historically profound without palaces. A community can be socially complex without writing. A people can possess deep knowledge without kings. Later civilizations often leave behind the hardest materials and therefore dominate memory stone walls, metal weapons, ceramics, inscriptions, monumental graves. Doggerland's people lived with materials that mostly vanish: wood, hide, fibre, bone, antler, bark, resin, and earth. Their world was not less meaningful because it was less durable. It was simply built from substances that time and water are very good at taking. To imagine the social life of this world, it is better to think in terms of territories of knowledge rather than territories of law. A group may know a sequence of seasonal places: a spring fishing ground, a summer wetland, an autumn nut grove, a winter sheltering area, a flint source, a crossing, a place where certain animals reliably pass. These places may overlap with the routes of other groups. Boundaries may exist, but they need not look like lines on a map. They may be understood through custom, relationship, marriage, exchange, avoidance, shared history, or conflict. The land belongs not as property in a modern sense, but as a network of use and memory. What survives in the record suggests that such mobility and familiarity were central to Mesolithic life. A lesser-known point is that small-scale societies can maintain large social worlds. People may live in small bands for much of the year, but that does not mean they are isolated. Seasonal gatherings, exchange of raw materials, shared rituals, marriage partnerships, and long-distance movement can connect communities across broad regions. Stone from one place can travel far from its source, styles of tools can spread, knowledge can move with people, stories can outlast a campsite. Doggerland, positioned between Britain and mainland Europe, may have been part of such wider networks. It was not necessarily a crowded kingdom, but it may have been a deeply connected human landscape. This kind of connection is easy to underestimate because it does not always leave obvious ruins. A meeting between groups at a river confluence might leave only a scatter of flint, hearth debris, butchered bone, or nothing preserved at all. A marriage alliance leaves no permanent marker unless bodies or objects are preserved in a way archaeologists can recognise. A story told about a dangerous marsh leaves no inscription. A child learning a route from an elder leaves no artefact except, perhaps, many years later, a tool dropped along the way. Archaeology sees the durable edges of life. Most of life itself passes through softer materials and memory. The phrase kingdom also risks implying hierarchy where the evidence does not require it. Mesolithic communities certainly had differences of age, skill, knowledge, reputation, kinship, and perhaps spiritual authority. Some people may have been exceptional hunters, makers, healers, navigators, or keepers of memory. Some may have carried special roles in burial practices or seasonal ceremonies, but there is no clear evidence for kingship in Doggerland. Authority may have been situational, earned, contested, temporary, or distributed. A person who knows the best crossing in a flooded season may matter greatly for one journey and much less for another. Power in such a world can be practical and relational rather than institutional. Yet one should not flatten these people into perfect equality either. The evidence remains too incomplete for easy certainty. Across hunter-gatherer societies known from ethnography, social arrangements vary widely. Some are strongly egalitarian, others have notable differences in status, wealth, ritual authority, or access to resources. Archaeology from Mesolithic Europe shows complexity, but not a single universal model. The careful position is to avoid both extremes. Not a primitive chaos without structure, not a centralised kingdom with rulers and subjects. Doggerland was likely organised through social forms adapted to mobility, ecology, and long-term knowledge of place. This makes the loss of the land even more significant. If there had been a palace, the tragedy would be obvious to later imagination because a palace gives disappearance a visible symbol. But Doggerland's centres may have been less monumental: a reliable fishing bend, a high dry ridge, a gathering place near water, a burial ground, a grove, a crossing, a place where flint was worked, a camp used so often that generations recognised it. When the sea took these places, it did not topple towers. It dissolved the geography of social life. It broke routes, scattered meeting points, removed landmarks, and changed who could easily reach whom. The kingdom without palaces was swallowed at the level where human life is actually lived. There is a strange dignity in that. The story refuses to reduce history to rulers. It asks us to treat a lost campsite with some of the seriousness usually reserved for a ruined capital. It asks us to understand that a riverbank can matter as much as a throne room if it holds the memory of generations. It asks us to look at a flint point and see not a small stone, but a hand, a task, a meal, a lesson, a moment of attention. The drowned land teaches that civilization is not the only form of human importance. Long before cities, people made worlds of meaning. This also changes how the term lost should be understood. Doggerland was not lost to its people in the way it was lost to modern science. They lived its disappearance. They saw parts of it change, shrink, flood, and vanish. For them, the loss was gradual, local, practical, emotional. For later ages, the loss became total because the sea hid the evidence and memory broke. The modern rediscovery is therefore not a rescue of a forgotten kingdom exactly, but a recognition that a forgotten human world existed where no land remains. The absence of palaces also protects the story from fantasy. Atlantis is often imagined as splendid because grandeur makes a loss feel worthy. Doggerland offers a more grounded kind of wonder. Its drama comes from reality: sea level rise, climate change, submerged forests, Mesolithic tools, seismic maps of buried rivers, and the human ability to live richly without leaving grand monuments. The evidence does not need a golden city under the waves. It already gives us something more haunting. A real landscape, real people, and a disappearance so complete that the modern sea had to be questioned before the land could return to thought. So the Lost Kingdom is a metaphor, but not an empty one. It names a world that had no king yet held human order, no palace yet held memory, no written law yet held knowledge, no walls yet held belonging. Its boundaries were rivers, wetlands, hunting paths, seasonal routes, and remembered places. Its wealth was food, skill, connection, and the ability to read a changing environment. Its fall was not a conquest, but an inundation, and when the sea finally covered it, what vanished was not a throne. What vanished was a lived geography, a human world without monuments, swallowed so quietly that only scattered bones, stones, and buried rivers remain to speak for it. Once a real landscape disappears beneath the sea, it enters a dangerous second life in the imagination. Water is good at making history feel older than it is and stranger than it needs to be. A ruined wall on land can be measured, dated, argued over, and placed in a known sequence. A drowned world is harder to hold still. It lies beyond ordinary sight. It belongs to storms, fishermen, divers, maps, and fragments. It invites comparison with every later tale of lands lost to water. Every city beneath waves, every island said to have vanished because of pride, punishment, disaster, or fate. Doggerland, because it is real, often finds itself standing beside legends. The comparison is understandable. Across many cultures, stories survive about floods, sunken lands, drowned cities, and vanished shores. Some are moral tales, some are warnings. Some may preserve distant memories of coastal change, storms, or inundation, transformed by generations of retelling. Others are literary creations, political allegories, religious narratives, or local folklore shaped by imagination as much as experience. Atlantis is the most famous, though it belongs first to ancient Greek philosophical writing rather than archaeology. Later European traditions speak of lost places such as Lyonesse off Cornwall or the city of Ys in Brittany, where the sea becomes both destroyer and keeper of memory. These stories are not evidence for Doggerland, but they show how deeply humans are drawn to the idea that water can cover a world and leave longing behind. The temptation is to join all these stories into one grand memory of a prehistoric catastrophe. It is a tempting idea because it feels poetic. Doggerland existed, Doggerland drowned. Later peoples told stories of drowned lands. Therefore, perhaps the stories remember the land, but the evidence remains incomplete, and caution is essential. No direct line can be securely drawn from the Mesolithic people of the North Sea Plain to classical Atlantis, medieval Lyonesse, Wiz, or later flood legends. Thousands of years stand between many of these traditions and the drowning of Doggerland. Languages change, peoples move, memories fracture, merge, and are remade. Similar stories can arise independently because floods, storms, and coastal erosion are common human experiences. Yet to reject a simple connection is not to dismiss the deeper pattern. Humans do remember water. They remember the year the shore broke, the storm that took houses, the tide that entered fields, the river that changed course, the island that became unreachable, the graves lost at the cliff edge. Such memories may not survive unchanged for millennia, but they shape the emotional vocabulary of cultures. A drowned land is one of the oldest and strongest images of loss because it combines helplessness with invisibility. Fire leaves ash, war leaves ruins, water leaves a surface that looks calm afterward, as if nothing ever stood beneath it. That calm is part of its cruelty. Doggerland belongs to this emotional family, even when it is kept separate from unsupported claims. It is not necessary to say that it is Atlantis. It is more powerful to say that it shows why Atlantis-like stories feel plausible to human beings. The sea really has swallowed inhabited landscapes. It has covered forests, camps, hunting grounds, river valleys, and burial places. It has turned familiar ground into unreachable depth. It has made real places disappear so thoroughly that later people could only rediscover them by accident. The legend is not proof of the archaeology. The archaeology explains the enduring force of the legend. A lesser-known detail is that many parts of the world contain submerged prehistoric landscapes. Not only the North Sea, around coastlines shaped by post-ice age sea level rise, ancient shorelines now lie underwater. In some places, archaeologists find drowned forests, submerged caves, fish traps, stone structures, or artifacts on continental shelves that were once dry or nearshore land. Doggerland is remarkable because of its scale and location, but it is part of a global pattern. At the end of the Ice Age, rising seas rearrange coastlines across the planet. Many ancient human landscapes are now underwater, meaning that the archaeological record of early coastal life is biased. We often study inland survival better than coastal survival because the old coast have drowned. This matters for how we think about prehistory. Humans have always been drawn to water. Rivers, lakes, wetlands, estuaries, and coasts offer food, movement, and diverse resources. If many late Ice Age and early Holocene coastlines now lie beneath the sea, then many important human places may be missing from the visible record. Doggerland is not simply a lost region. It is a reminder that prehistory has a drowned edge. The map of ancient life is incomplete not only because time has passed, but because the ocean has taken some of the best evidence. Legends of drowned lands then occupy an uneasy border between memory and metaphor. Some may be inspired by real local event storms, erosion, tsunamis, gradual encroachment, or catastrophic flooding. Others may use water as a symbol of divine judgment, moral collapse, or the instability of human pride. In many stories, the drowned city falls because people grow arrogant, careless, sinful, or deaf to warning. Doggerland does not fit that moral pattern. Its people did not cause the ice sheets to melt. They did not invite the sea through luxury or corruption. Their world drowned because climate, geography, and time moved on a scale beyond human control. That difference makes Doggerland more sobering than many legends. There is no moral lesson of punishment, only the physical fact of vulnerability. Still, later stories often seek reasons where nature offers processes. A slow rise in sea level is difficult to narrate. A city drowned for arrogance is easier to remember. A storm sent by fate is more emotionally satisfying than a sediment core showing brackish transition. Human storytelling compresses, sharpens, and moralizes. It turns centuries into nights, coastlines into gates, environmental change into warnings ignored. This does not make stories worthless. It makes them human. They preserve not always the facts of events, but the feeling of being at the mercy of water. Doggerland, by contrast, asks for a different kind of attention. It asks the imagination to stay with slowness. It asks us to picture not one shining city drowned at noon, but generations of families adjusting to a world that grows wetter, saltier, narrower, and less familiar. It asks us to understand that a place can become legendary not because it was splendid, but because it was ordinary and then gone. The campfire, the trackway, the fishing place, the grove. The river crossing. These are not the usual furniture of myth, but they are the furniture of life. Their disappearance is harder to dramatise and harder to dismiss. The stories of Atlantis, Lyonesse, Weiss, and other drowned places also reveal something about the human need to imagine what lies underwater. People do not like blankness. A sea horizon invites filling. If there are strange stones offshore, they may become ruins. If bells are heard in waves, they may belong to a sunken church. If a storm exposes tree stumps in the sand, they may be treated as evidence of an older land half remembered. Sometimes these stories are wrong in detail, but they respond to real observations. Coasts do change, forests are drowned, churches do fall from eroding cliffs, islands are lost. The line between folklore and environmental memory can be thin, but it must still be crossed carefully. For Doggerland, the safest and richest approach is to let legend and evidence speak beside each other, without forcing them into one claim. The legends show that drowned worlds matter to human imagination. The evidence shows that one of the greatest drowned worlds of Northern Europe was real. Together they create a layered story, not proof that ancient myths remember Doggerland, but proof that the fear and fascination behind such myths are grounded in the Earth's behaviour. The sea has done what stories say it can do. It has taken land, hidden lives, and left only hints. In that sense, Doggerland is both less and more than legend. Less, because it does not offer a golden city, a doomed king, or a single moral fall. More, because it is not invented. Its buried rivers are real. Its animal bones are real. Its flint tools are real. Its drowned forests and peat layers are real. Its disappearance is not a metaphor, though it can become one. It stands beneath the North Sea as a factual answer to an ancient imaginative fear. Yes, a world can be swallowed by water. Yes. People can live there first. Yes. Time can make the loss so complete that later ages must argue the land back into existence. And perhaps that is why the Lost Kingdom remains so haunting. It sits between science and story, correcting both. It tells legend to be humble, because not every sunken world was a jeweled empire. It tells science to be expansive, because every sediment core and flint blade belongs to human longing as well as data. The drowned plain does not need to be Atlantis. It does not need towers. It does not need punishment from gods or a single night of destruction. It needs only the truth that is already there. A vast human landscape once lay beneath the present sea, and when it vanished, it joined the oldest category of human sorrow, the memory of land lost to water. The closer one looks at Doggerland, the more the mystery becomes a problem of survival in the record. The land was real. The drowning was real. Human presence is supported by artifacts, animal remains, environmental evidence, and the broader pattern of Mesolithic life around the North Sea. Yet the details most people want to know are exactly the details the sea has made hardest to recover. Where did people sleep? How many lived there? Which places were visited every year? Where were the dead buried? What routes connected one group to another? What stories did they carry away when the water rose? The evidence can answer some questions with confidence, but others remain suspended in the dark water between fact and inference. Underwater archaeology is not simply archaeology with more equipment. It is a different struggle with time, visibility, pressure, cost, and movement. On land, an excavation can expose a surface, map features, document layers, and return day after day to the same square of Earth. Beneath the North Sea, conditions are far less forgiving. Currents move sediment, storms reshape seabed features, visibility can be poor, sites may lie beneath meters of sand, peat, or marine deposits. Others may have been eroded away, scattered, or dragged by fishing gear. Even locating a promising place can require expensive surveys, careful modelling, and a degree of luck that no research plan can fully command. This is why many clues from Doggerland arrive without their original context. A flint tool from a dredged beach may be real and important, but it may have travelled from its exact resting place. An antler point from a fishing net can show human skill, but not necessarily the camp where it was made or used. Animal bones pulled from the seabed reveal ancient ecology, but they may be mixed from different periods or moved from their first location, without secure context. Each object becomes both a witness and a riddle. It speaks, but not in complete sentences. Context is the heart of archaeology because human meaning often lies in relationship. A single flint blade tells one story. A flint blade found beside a hearth, near butchered deer bone, with pollen from a certain environment, sealed beneath a dated layer, tells a much fuller one. A bone point alone is useful. A bone point found within a fishing structure near an ancient river channel would be transformative. The difficulty with Doggerland is that many finds are isolated from the scenes that gave them meaning. The sea has not only hidden the evidence, it has rearranged the grammar of the evidence. Scholars still debate the scale of settlement because the preserved record is uneven. Some reconstructions imagine Doggerland as a rich and widely used landscape, while others urge caution, noting that ecological potential does not automatically prove dense occupation everywhere. The truth may vary by time and place. Some river valleys and wetland edges may have been highly attractive. Other areas may have been used lightly or seasonally. Some periods may have seen greater activity than others as climate, vegetation, animal populations, and coastlines shifted. No single explanation fully accounts for the human geography of the entire drowned plain across thousands of years. A lesser-known difficulty is that submerged landscapes can preserve and destroy at the same time. Waterlogged, oxygen-poor sediments can protect wood, plant remains, bone, and peat in ways that dry land often cannot. In the right conditions, ancient organic material may survive spectacularly well, but those conditions are patchy. A preserved surface may lie sealed beneath sediment in one place, while a nearby area has been scoured away. A storm can expose a deposit and begin destroying it before researchers ever know it exists. Modern dredging can remove layers that took millennia to form. The archive is not a library waiting quietly to be opened. It is a moving, eroding, partly buried archive under pressure. Dating adds another layer of challenge. The drowning of Doggerland unfolds over long periods, with different areas becoming wetland, estuary, island, or sea at different times. An artifact found offshore may belong to a particular moment, but without secure stratigraphy it can be difficult to connect it to a precise phase of the landscape. Radiocarbon dating can help when organic material is available, yet even dates must be interpreted carefully. Was a piece of wood growing in place? Washed from elsewhere or redeposited later? Was an animal bone from a living herd on dry land? From a carcass moved by water, or from a layer disturbed by later processes? The answers matter because they shape the human story. Scientific mapping has made the invisible landscape more visible, but maps can also create a false sense of certainty. A beautiful reconstruction of rivers and coastlines looks complete, almost as if one could walk through it. In reality, each map is a model built from data, interpretation, and probability. Seismic surveys reveal buried forms, but those forms need ground truthing through cores and samples. Sea level curves show trends, but local conditions can vary. Vegetation reconstructions depend on preserved pollen and sediment. The evidence remains incomplete, and good scholarship keeps that incompleteness visible rather than covering it with confidence. This fragility is not a weakness of the story. It is part of the story. Doggerland matters because it forces a confrontation with how easily human worlds can slip beyond the reach of ordinary history. Later societies often appear more real to us because they left harder ruins, not because their lives were richer. The people of the drowned plain lived in wood, hide, fibre, bone, stone, memory, and movement. Then the sea covered much of the evidence, and the remains that survived were scattered or buried. Their world did not become less important. It became harder to prove in the ways modern minds prefer. The underwater record also challenges the idea of archaeological completeness. Many ancient coastlines around the world are now submerged because sea levels rose after the Ice Age. If early human communities often favoured coasts, rivers, wetlands, and estuaries, then some of the most important places in prehistory may be underwater today. Doggerland is a dramatic example, but not an isolated problem. It reminds researchers that the visible archaeological record is biased toward places that remain dry, accessible, and preserved. Whole chapters of human adaptation may be missing or distorted because the sea now covers the evidence. For the public imagination, uncertainty can be frustrating. People want the map of the Lost Kingdom, the names of its settlements, the story of its final day, but honesty requires a quieter answer. There may have been no settlements in the later sense. There were no surviving names. There was probably no single final day for all of Doggerland. There were many places, many endings, many movements, many losses, and many unknowns. The drama lies not in pretending to know more than the evidence allows, but in recognising how much can still be recovered from fragments. A bone, a seed, a layer of peat, a drowned tree stump, a flint edge, a buried channel each gives a little more shape to the vanished world. There is also an ethical dimension to this fragility. Submerged prehistoric landscapes are part of human heritage. Even when they lie far from sight, they can be damaged before their value is understood. Offshore development, aggregate extraction, fishing, and climate-driven changes all interact with ancient seabeds. This does not mean modern society must freeze the sea in place, but it does mean the hidden record deserves attention. Once a submerged site is destroyed, it cannot be excavated later. Once a context is lost, no future technology can fully restore it. The drowned kingdom has already survived one great erasure. It should not suffer a second through neglect. And still, despite all these difficulties, Doggerland keeps returning. It returns in scientific papers, museum collections, beach finds, seismic maps, public fascination, and the quiet shock of realizing that a sea can be younger than human memory in deep time. It returns not as a complete kingdom, but as a broken one, demanding patience. Its fragility teaches a discipline of imagination to picture what is possible without claiming what is unproven, to feel the human weight of loss without inventing false certainty, to let the gaps remain gaps while still listening to what the surviving evidence says. The sea keeps many secrets, but it has not kept all of them. It has allowed enough to rise for the outline of a drowned world to emerge. The rest remains beneath waves and sediment, scattered, sealed, disturbed, or gone forever. That incompleteness is haunting because it mirrors the ancient loss itself. Doggerland disappeared first as land, then as memory, then almost as a subject of knowledge. Modern archaeology has brought it back only partly, like a shoreline appearing in fog. The shape is visible, but not the whole detail, and perhaps that is the closest the present can come to the truth of a world swallowed by the sea, enough evidence to know it was there, enough mystery to remind us how much the water can take. The sea keeps its dead in ways that land rarely can. On land, a place may be destroyed, rebuilt, ploughed, buried, excavated, named again, and folded into later memory. Underwater, disappearance becomes more complete. The surface gives no obvious sign of what lies beneath. Waves cover grief without preserving its shape. A valley becomes a fishing ground. A camp becomes a patch of sediment. A path becomes a depth contour. The dead of Doggerland, whether human, animal, or vegetal, are not gathered into one visible ruin. They are scattered through deposits, sealed in peat, dragged by currents, lifted by nets, or lost entirely. The sea does not only drown places, it changes how disappearance itself can be remembered. By the time Doggerland is gone, the geography of northwestern Europe has been remade. Britain is no longer joined to the mainland by lowland routes. The North Sea now forms a body of water where people, animals, and plants once crossed on foot. This separation matters for later prehistory, because water changes movement. It does not end contact, but it transforms it. Journeys that once followed rivers, ridges, and open ground now require boats, skill, timing, and favourable conditions. Exchange can continue across water, and it surely does in later periods, but the nature of connection shifts. The making of Britain as an island is not just a cartographic event, it is a change in the everyday possibilities of travel, contact, and memory. For the descendants of people who once used the drowned plain, the loss may have been absorbed into new lives along new coasts. Some groups likely moved west, some east or south, some into higher and more stable landscapes. They did not vanish simply because Doggerland vanished. Human populations are not the same as territories. People can survive the death of a homeland, yet survival does not erase displacement. A community that leaves low ground carries skills and memories into another place. But the old landscape cannot travel with them except in speech, habit, story, and perhaps in the routes they no longer take. What survives in the record suggests movement and adaptation, but the emotional cost remains beyond direct proof. The loss of Doggerland may also have changed the relationship between people and coastlines. Those who lived through rising seas, expanding estuaries, and perhaps the Storegga tsunami would have known that water is not passive. It feeds, connects, hides, and destroys. Later communities around the North Sea continue to rely on coasts, rivers, and wetlands because these places remain productive, but they do so in a world where the sea has become a defining presence. Fishing, shellfish gathering, boat use, tidal knowledge, and coastal movement become increasingly important across many regions of post-Ice Age Europe. Scholars still debate the exact cultural consequences of Doggerland's disappearance, but the broader pattern is clear environmental change helps shape how people live, move, and imagine danger. There is a lesser-known consequence in the animals as well. The flooding of the land bridge affects not only humans, but also the movement of species between Britain and continental Europe. As Britain becomes an island, animal populations are increasingly isolated. Some species that once crossed freely can no longer do so naturally. Others disappear from Britain over time because of climate, habitat change, hunting, or isolation. The precise causes vary by species and period, and no single explanation fully accounts for every extinction or absence. Still, the sea's arrival creates a biological boundary as well as a human one. A drowned plain becomes an evolutionary filter. Plants, too, inherit the new geography. Seeds can travel by wind, bird, water, and human movement, but land connections matter. As coastlines stabilize in their new positions, ecological communities develop on either side of the sea with growing separation. Wetlands form, forests expand or retreat, and later farming communities will transform the land again. Doggerland's drowning is not the end of change. It is one enormous episode in a continuing sequence of ecological reorganisation. The sea closes one landscape and opens another set of coastal environments, though for the lost plain itself, that opening is indistinguishable from erasure. For human memory, the consequences are harder to trace. There may have been stories of lost ground, dangerous tides, or places beneath water, but such stories leave little direct archaeological evidence. Over generations, memory can become compressed, moralised, relocated, or forgotten. A real crossing may become a tale of ancestors, a drowned hunting ground may become a warning about the sea, a tsunami may become a story of the water coming wrong. Or perhaps many memories simply fade because new generations grow up with the sea as normal. The evidence remains incomplete, and it is possible that much of Doggerland's human memory dissolved without ever entering later legend in recognisable form. That possibility is unsettling because modern people often trust that important events will be remembered. But remembrance requires systems writing, monuments, institutions, repeated storytelling, stable communities, and places where memory can attach. Doggerland's people had memory, but the places that anchored it disappeared. When the river bend is underwater, when the grove is gone, when the burial ground lies beyond reach, when descendants live elsewhere. The work of remembering becomes harder. The sea does not merely remove the object of memory, it removes the stage on which memory is renewed. In this sense, the drowned world teaches that landscapes are not backgrounds to history. They are active containers of human continuity. A route walked each year holds social meaning. A camp reused across generations becomes part of identity. A ridge above marsh may matter because people gather there, not because it is geologically impressive. When such places vanish, people lose more than resources. They lose the physical reminders that make past lives feel present. Doggerland's disappearance is therefore not only environmental history, it is the history of memory losing its ground. The sea also creates distance in the modern imagination. Because Doggerland is underwater, it feels more mysterious than a lost forest or abandoned inland site. Yet the water covering it is not mystical. It is the outcome of measurable processes: ice melt, sea level rise, isostatic adjustment, sedimentation, storm activity, erosion, and time. This tension between the ordinary and the uncanny is part of its power. The causes are natural, but the result feels almost impossible. A whole human landscape lies beneath one of the busiest seas in the modern world, hidden under roots of commerce, energy, fishing, and national history. The ancient past is not remote, it is directly below the present. That below matters. Modern ships crossing the North Sea pass over places that once had weather, paths, animal calls, and fires. Offshore wind turbines rise above seabeds that may contain traces of older worlds. Fishing grounds overlay drowned valleys. Pipelines cross prehistoric surfaces. Scientific cores sink into sediments that remember forests. The present does not replace the past cleanly. It rests on top of it, often without noticing. The North Sea is therefore not just water between nations. It is a layered archive where modern infrastructure, medieval seafaring, Roman trade, Mesolithic movement, Ice Age animals, and geological processes overlap in one restless basin. The consequences of Doggerland's loss also echo in how modern societies think about sea level rise. It is not a simple lesson, because the ancient world and the modern world are profoundly different. Mesolithic communities were mobile, small-scale, and not dependent on cities, ports, roads, electrical grids, or fixed borders. Modern societies are deeply invested in immovable infrastructure, yet the old story still matters because it shows that sea level rise is not abstract. It moves coastlines. It contaminates freshwater. It changes routes. It turns familiar places into hazards. It forces choices about retreat, adaptation, and memory. The ancient people of Doggerland face these realities with different tools, but the physical logic is recognisable. The sea keeps its dead, but not silently. It speaks through what it returns: a bone in a net, a flint on a beach, a buried forest exposed by erosion, a seismic image of a river that no longer sees the sun. Each returned piece is small, and none can restore the lost voices, but together they remind the present that disappearance is not the same as non-existence. Doggerland existed. Its people lived inside a changing world. Its loss reshaped coastlines, routes, ecologies, and perhaps memories. The water covered it, but the covering was not perfect. And so the drowned kingdom remains beneath the North Sea as both absence and inheritance. It is absent because no one can walk its plains or stand beside its rivers. It is inheritance because modern geography, modern coastlines, modern islands, and modern questions still carry the result of its disappearance. The sea that keeps its dead also keeps the outline of a warning land can become memory. Memory can become silence, and silence can last until chance, science, and curiosity bring the hidden world back into view. What the drowned world warns is not that every coast must fall in the same way, or that every society is helpless before the sea. History is never that simple. Doggerland belongs to a very different human world from the present smaller populations, mobile communities, no cities of concrete and steel, no harbours full of global trade, no written law fixing property to coastlines, no national borders drawn across floodplains, no power grids, railways, highways, airports, or financial systems built on the assumption that the shoreline will behave. The people of the drowned plain had fewer material protections than modern societies, but they also carried fewer immovable burdens. When a camp became unsafe, it could sometimes be moved. When a route failed, another might be tried. When a shoreline shifted, people adjusted through knowledge, mobility, and memory. Modern civilization has more technology, but it has also tied itself tightly to place. That is why Doggerland feels less like a distant curiosity and more like a mirror held at an uncomfortable angle. It shows a real landscape transformed by rising seas. It shows that coastlines can migrate across distances large enough to erase entire countries of memory. It shows that slow change can be more powerful than sudden disaster, because slow change becomes normal while it is happening. A child born into a smaller world does not experience it as smaller. It is simply the world. Only elders remember the former crossing, the older shoreline, the place where trees stood before salt reached their roots. Across generations, loss can become ordinary until the old map survives only in fragments. The warning is not dramatic in the manner of legend. There is no cursed king, no shining city punished for arrogance, no single night when all meaning disappears. The warning is quieter, and therefore more serious. Landscapes that feed people can become landscapes that force departure. Fresh water can become brackish. Familiar routes can break. Productive wetlands can become open sea. The edge that offers food can also move inland. A society may adapt many times and still lose the ground that made those adaptations possible. No single explanation fully accounts for the fate of every person who lived in Doggerland. But the physical pattern is clear when sea level rises across low land. The choice is narrow. A lesser-known lesson lies in the way Doggerland disappeared from knowledge. The sea did not only take the land, it nearly took the evidence that the land had ever mattered. Without fishermen pulling up bones, dredged sand revealing tools, scientists reading seismic data, and researchers piecing together sediments, pollen, and artifacts, the modern world might still think of the North Sea only as water. This is a warning about memory as much as climate. Human beings often assume that what matters will leave a visible mark. Doggerland says otherwise. A world can be central to life and still vanish without monuments. A people can know a landscape intimately, and later ages can forget that the landscape existed. Modern sea level rise is not identical to the post-Ice Age transformation, but the comparison carries weight because the basic consequences remain recognisable. Water moving inland can threaten settlements, roads, fields, ports, graves, sacred places, archives, and ordinary homes. It can enter freshwater systems. It can make storms more damaging. It can force choices between defence, adaptation, and retreat. Modern communities may have satellites, models, seawalls, pumps, laws, insurance systems, and engineering projects. But they also face the same ancient question in a new form. What happens when the land people trust becomes less secure than memory says it should be? Doggerland also warns against thinking of disaster only as a future event. For the people who lived through its decline, the disaster was already present in small decisions. A camp abandoned, a path avoided, a marsh crossed with more fear than before, a fishing place changed by salt, a storm remembered for reaching too far inland. These are the early chapters of large transformations. They rarely feel historic while they are happening. They feel inconvenient, frightening, costly, or strange. Only later, when the pattern is complete, does the scale become clear. By then, the old landscape may be underwater. And yet the story is not only a warning of a loss, it is also a record of resilience. The people of Doggerland didn't live as passive figures in a doomed painting. They observed, moved, learned, repaired, hunted, gathered, fished, remembered, and survived as long as survival was possible. Their descendants continued elsewhere. Human life carried on beyond the drowned plain. The sea took the land, but not necessarily the people. This matters because environmental change is not only a story of collapse, it is a story of adaptation under pressure, of knowledge tested by unfamiliar conditions, of communities making choices with incomplete information. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests endurance as well as disappearance. Still, resilience should not be used to soften the loss too much. Survival elsewhere does not make a drowned homeland less real. When Doggerland vanished, a unique geography vanished with it. Its rivers, marshes, hunting paths, plant communities, animal routes, gathering places, and remembered landmarks. Even if people lived on, the world that had organised part of their lives ended. That distinction matters for every threatened landscape. A community can relocate, but a place cannot always be replaced. The new ground may save bodies while the old ground holds memory. This is why the drowned kingdom continues to matter. It is ancient, but not irrelevant. It is silent, but not empty. It lies beneath a modern sea, but it speaks to modern coastlines, modern uncertainty, and modern assumptions about permanence. It reminds us that maps are temporary documents. Shorelines are negotiations, not promises. The places that seem fixed may be resting inside processes far older and stronger than human planning. Civilizations often build as if the ground beneath them is final. The Earth does not share that belief. Beneath the North Sea, Doggerland remains as a buried warning written without words. It says that a landscape can feed generations and still be lost. It says that people can adapt bravely and still be forced away. It says that memory needs places, and places can drown. It says that the sea is not merely a boundary on a map, but a moving force with a history of remaking worlds. And in the darkness below the waves, where ancient rivers lie under sand and peat. The Lost Kingdom keeps its final lesson. The most fragile thing in any civilization may not be its walls, its tools, or even its people, but its confidence that tomorrow's shoreline will look like yesterday's. The sea is quiet now over the drowned plain, or at least it seems quiet from a distance. Waves pass over sandbanks and buried river channels without pausing to explain what lies below. Ships cross the grey water, birds follow the wind, nets sink and rise. The modern world moves above the old one, mostly unaware that beneath the cold surface there are traces of another geography, another rhythm of life, another human relationship with the earth. Doggerland is gone, but it is not nothing. Its absence has a shape. It lives in the gap between Britain and the continent, in the shallow banks beneath the North Sea, in the bones brought up from the seabed, in the flints found far from any dry ancient shore, in the peat and pollen that remember forests where waves now move. It lives in the knowledge that a place can disappear so completely that later generations must rediscover the fact of land itself. There is something humbling in that. The people of the drowned plain did not know they were part of a mystery. They were not symbols of climate, memory, or human fragility. They were simply alive. They woke in cold mornings, watched weather, followed animals, repaired tools, carried children, tended fires, searched for food, and returned to places that mattered. They lived inside their world as all people do, trusting what could be trusted, adapting where they had to, and remembering what had changed. Then the water rose, and the familiar became uncertain. The paths shortened, the rivers widened, the edges moved, the land grew smaller, until even memory had less ground on which to stand. What remains is not a ruined city glowing beneath the sea, but something softer and more difficult to hold the idea of ordinary life erased by natural time. No towers are needed, no palace is needed. A lost river is enough, a campsite is enough, a drowned grove, a vanished crossing, a shoreline remembered by one generation and unknown to the next. These are enough to make the past feel close. And so the story settles back into the water. The North Sea keeps moving and the sand shifts. The old valleys sleep beneath sediment. Somewhere below, sealed in darkness, a fragment of antler, a flint edge, or the root of an ancient tree may still wait in silence. Above it, the waves continue their patient work, covering and uncovering, hiding and returning, as if the sea has all the time in the world. The Lost Kingdom remains there, not restored, not fully known. But present in the deepest way, a vanished place can be present as a reminder that land, memory, and human life are all more fragile than they appear, and that even when the water closes over a world, something of it may still endure beneath the tide,